Hello. The purpose of this particular video is to discuss the Chicago school and cultural and subcultural theories of crime. The Chicago school and subcultural theories make several assumptions. The first assumption is that individuals' behaviors are influenced by their environment. Essentially, what they're arguing here is that behavior is a large function of people's circumstances, in particularly the geographical areas in which they live. The second assumption is that community characteristics negatively impact their residents' behaviors. So, for example, living in a neighborhood that is poor in terms of its economic advantage, as well as a neighborhood that has a negative cultural value system, all of these characteristics that are endemic to a community, according to this perspective, can impact people's behaviors. And then lastly, this perspective or this theory argues or assumes that individuals who live in lower class communities have been exposed to a deviant value system that promotes criminal behavior. The intellectual origins of the Chicago school are what we attribute social disorganization theory to, as well as the cultural theories. This perspective is called the Chicago School because in the late 1800s and early 1900s, the United States was experiencing an increase in the growth of major cities in the United States. Today, all of the urban centers that we know started during the late 1800s and early 1900s. So, for example, cities like Chicago, Philadelphia, and New York were cities that were starting to grow at that time. And largely, the growth of these cities was based on an influx of immigrants from Eastern Europe, as well as an influx of blacks who were migrating from the South to the North to work in these cities. When these two groups moved to these cities, they moved there for the purposes of working in industry. And by industry, what I'm really referring to are factories. At the time, as these people were all moving into these cities had no formal social agencies. So, for example, there were no social workers, no garbage collectors, and no police officers. And as a result of that, the people who lived in these cities were responsible for providing social workers services themselves, responsible for collecting their own garbage and disposing of their own garbage, as well as enforcing laws and policing their communities. As a result of these circumstances, these large cities, Chicago in particular, experienced mass chaos, specifically because the people who lived there did not always take up the responsibility of policing and controlling the behaviors of individuals who lived in their cities. Because of this chaos, it provided a ripe opportunity for academics and scholars to come in and study Chicago and study how crime grew, spread, and functioned. The University of Chicago was located in Chicago at that time, and many scholars from the University of Chicago observed what was happening in Chicago for the purposes of creating theoretical arguments around the origins of crime. One of those scholars from the University of Chicago was a man named Park. And Park looked at Chicago and how Chicago grew and made several observations. First observation was that cities tend to grow and follow a natural pattern of evolution. He argued that just like plant life and animal life, cities grew in a sequence of events that involve invasion, domination, and succession. Let me give you an example. Think about weeds and how weeds come to be. We know that weeds get into people's yards because they start off as seeds, and those seeds are either carried by wind, water, or rain into people's yards. That's a process of invasion. Once the seeds of weeds get into your yard, then they start to dominate your yard. And by dominate, what I mean is that weeds tend to kill off healthy grass and healthy lawns. And then finally, the last stage of this process was called succession. Not only do the weeds invade and dominate your yard, but they then succeed the previous plant life that existed in your yard. So once they invade and kill off the healthy grass and plants, then they replace those plants. Well, Park argued that neighborhoods in cities also grew in the same way. You can have a healthy neighborhood, and then a business or a new group of people will invade. They will dominate the people that lived in that particular neighborhood, and eventually those individuals will move out of that neighborhood, and then the new people or businesses that moved into the neighborhood will take over and replace them. Another man came along by the name of Burgess, and Burgess took Park's ideas about the way in which cities grow, and he applied them to what are called the concentric zones. So the concentric zones is basically a description of how cities are currently set up, or how particularly Chicago was set up at that time. According to Burgess, cities are organized in concentric zones. And I'm going to show you that. So you have zone 1, which is a business district, zone 2, which is a zone in transition, zone 3 is a working class zone, zone 4 is a residential zone, and zone 5 is a commuter zone. Here's a picture of what Burgess described in terms of how he believes cities are organized. And I'm going to walk you all through this. So if you see let's start with the center. If you see where it's listed as 1, according to Burgess, this was essentially the center of the city. He called this zone the business district zone. And according to Burgess, this is basically what we call today the downtown area of a city. You have your skyscrapers, you have your financial institutions, and any type of factories as well as railroads tend to run through those downtown central business districts. The second zone, which is illustrated by the number 2 here, is your transition zone. And according to Burgess, the transition zone contain dilapidated housing. And by dilapidated housing, what I mean is housing that's essentially falling apart, but people still lived in those houses. You also have factories as well in this area. And then lastly, you have abandoned buildings existing in this area. Zone 3 is what Burgess called the working class zone. And according to Burgess, single family tenements were built in those particular areas. And then you had zone 4, which Burgess called the residential zone. And you had single family homes that also existed in that particular area. And then finally, the last zone, which is the outer ring and is labeled as zone 5, is what Burgess called the commuter zone. And these are essentially the suburbs. Think about the cities that you have seen, particularly the large metropolitan urban cities. Are they arranged in the way that I just described? Do they have a central business district? Do they have a suburb area? And do they have everything in between? According to Burgess, how does this relate to crime? Well, Burgess observed that crime was the highest in those zones that were closest to the central business district. Specifically, crime was the highest in the transition zone, which is the zone, again, that is listed here as number 2. And then the further an individual moved out away from the central business district, Burgess observed that crime tended to decrease. Two other scholars from the University of Chicago were named Shaw and McKay. And Shaw and McKay took the work of Parks and Burgess and created what is known today as the social disorganization theory. They observed that through Chicago that certain neighborhoods have more crime than others. And they observed that the neighborhoods that have more crime tend to have 3 common problems. First, those areas with high crime rates had physical dilapidation, meaning that the buildings and the structures in those neighborhoods were falling apart. Those neighborhoods also suffered from extreme and concentrated poverty. And then lastly, those neighborhoods with high crime rates also tended to have what they called racial heterogeneity. And by racial heterogeneity, what they meant is that those neighborhoods had a diverse number of racial groups. Why was this a problem? Well, according to Sean McKay, this was a problem because if you have a neighborhood with lots of different racial groups, those racial groups will not share the same value system. And it was Sean McKay's contention then that if a group of people do not share the same value system, then they cannot come together to exercise control over their communities. They cannot come together to police their communities because there are just so many differences in value systems. And when you think about Chicago at that time, as I just explained, you had different immigrant groups coming from Western Europe, and you had Black people from all over the country coming from the South. And all of these individuals were all living in that transition zone, which was zone number 2. According to Sean McKay, these different groups had lots of conflict as well as different value systems. And because of that, they were unable to exercise informal social control and control crime in their neighborhood. So, according to Sean McKay, this was a central feature of large cities like Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, etc. All of them followed the same ecological principles. In review, social disorganization theory argues that structural conditions like poverty, racial heterogeneity, physical dilapidation, high mobility of residents, and other social ills, all of those things created social disorganization, which is basically a lack of unity and shared value system amongst the residents of those neighborhoods. And when that occurred, they argue that individuals would be unable to control the behaviors of its residents, and as a result of that, you would see high rates of criminal behavior. There were several other theories that were discussed in the chapter, and those particular theories then made arguments that culture is central to why certain areas and certain groups of people will have higher rates of crime. One particular crime was created by Barracuda and Wolfgang, which is called subcultural theory of crime. Barracuda and Wolfgang argue that violence is a culturally learned way of dealing with life. Essentially, what they argued is that some cultures actually promote violence as a means of dealing with issues in life, specifically issues between people. Then there was another theorist named Miller, and Miller created a theory called focal concerns theory, and he argued in this theory that lower class people or groups of people have a distinct cultural value system that emphasizes and promotes 6 different values. The first value is fate, which basically means that they believe that their destiny is determined. Autonomy is the value that individuals need to strive for independence. Trouble is the value that states that individuals value getting into and out of trouble. Toughness argues that people will, in this environment or this cultural value system, will promote being tough. Excitement states that people from the lower class value being excited, as well as being in situations that provide thrills. And then lastly, smartness. Smartness does not necessarily refer to being book smart in this case, but being street smart, being able to live by one's wits and being able to outsmart one's adversaries, specifically authority figures. The last perspective that was discussed in your textbook was the code of the streets, which was created by Elijah Anderson. Elijah Anderson argued that African Americans in particular a code and live by a code. Because African Americans do not experience material wealth, Anderson argued that they emphasize the things that they can control in their lives, which is respect. According to Anderson, respect is at the heart of the code that African Americans promote and live by. Anderson argued that African Americans believe that violence in some situations is a necessary and responsible response to conflict with other people, and that if people do not use violence in certain situations, they will increase the likelihood that they will be victimized and viewed as weak. Elijah Anderson argued that there are 2 types of families in the African American urban community. Decent families was the first types of families who accept mainstream values and attempt to install them in their children. They tend to be working poor. They tend to be generally involved in a church community, strict with their children, respect authority, and are polite and cooperative. However, Elijah Anderson argued that there are also street families, and these families lack consideration for others, have a superficial sense of family and community, are disorganized, extremely aggressive with their children in terms of physical punishment, and their children generally come up hard. So you can note from all of these theories that I've discussed that the general argument here made by both subcultural and cultural theories, as was the Chicago school theory, is that environment matters in shaping cultures, and that under certain structural, if certain neighborhoods or communities have structural issues related to poverty, physical dilapidation of the buildings in those areas, racial heterogeneity, and other issues, that those types of neighborhoods will create subcultures that can be problematic and create crime. They can also create a situation where individuals in those communities cannot unify together to solve those communities' problems, particularly crime. All of the policy implications associated with these perspectives like neighborhood watch groups, community organizations, Chicago Area Project, Midnight Basketball, and Peace Builders, are policies that can be directed towards unifying people in neighborhoods to solve the problem of crime. Please read over this chapter when you get a chance and email me with any questions that you may have. Thank you for listening to this video.